you use Uber Conference, you wouldn't mind.
Right. So at any rate, so that was rule number one, and the rule of courage. And rule number two, look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look especially for the things that you and everybody around you take for granted that are there that you're not seeing, and bring them into the realm of visibility, and then proceed from there. But there's a problem with, and these were thrilling to me. This is the second rule, is the rule of awe, wonder, surprise, curiosity. So these were absolutely thrilling. And I discovered that there was this gang that I could hang out with who would not pick up their baseball bats and move to an entirely different field just to get rid of me, which did happen to me in my childhood. And there was a simple reason: they could not say no to me. They were dead. So, yes,
it does give one a distinct advantage.
But that became the center of my life, science, from that point on, starting with theoretical physics and microbiology. And I started reading 2 books a day. One book under the desk at school, which may be very unpopular with my teachers, and another book when I got home at night. And then by the time I was 12, I was actually collecting minor scientific credentials. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. The kid who built it went on to go to MIT. When I contacted him 40 years later, because he was so brilliant, to find out what he had done with his life, he was still designing computers that would play games. See, it was exactly where I left him. But I was schlepped off to a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo. I'm sure it was a 5-minute courtesy call to keep my mother off his back. And it turned into an hour-long conversation, because the hottest topic in science at the moment was Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe. It was the year that Fred Hoyle, the champion of steady state theory, knew unequivocally, without a shadow of a doubt, he was going to destroy Big Bang theory and it would never be heard of again. So the head of the graduate physics department and I'm a 12-year-old, for God's sakes. What's he doing with a 12-year-old in his office? We're discussing the interpretation of the Doppler shift, which is key to this conflict between these two ideas. And I was tutored by the head of research and development for the Moog Valve Company, which made the valves for the first jets to break the sound barrier and the first jet to go to the edge of space, the first rocket plane, and a whole bunch of things were happening to me when I was 12 years old.
Awesome.
So I was taken reasonably seriously in microbiology and theoretical physics and science in general. But here's the problem. This is all premised on a dictum from, I would suspect it was a book for juveniles, for teenagers, that said the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And there's always been a problem with that. What the hell is the truth? Well, these days, once upon a time, nobody made a statement in the media, and no politician made a statement without fact-checking it first. And Donald Trump ended the age of fact-checking. We entered the age not of truth, but of lies. Anything you made up, you could say, and if you get enough people to agree with you, it was a new truth. And there's always been a level of consensual validation, people agreeing, people being attracted to an idea. Galileo believed there was a legitimate truth in nature itself. And you didn't have to rely on those few people who had been seized by the Holy Spirit and to whom God had dictated large amounts of prose, poetry, and imagery. And he said that nature is a book, and we can learn to understand that book using, he didn't say mathematics, he said using geometry, which was the dominant form of math at the time. It was 70 years before the invention of equations. They weren't around yet. So these are two different approaches to the truth. Inspiration by God himself, and looking at the book of nature and trying to understand it with the tools of geometry and with something else that Galileo invented, which is the lab, doing tabletop experiments that would give you data. He invented the idea, the old conundrum was, does a light object, a feather, fall at a different speed than a heavy object, a cannonball? And to discover this, Galileo was supposed to have gone to the top of the Tower of Pisa and dropped a cannonball and a feather off. And he came to the conclusion that despite what Aristotle had said, and Aristotle was treated like scripture at that point by the scholars of the day, in other words, you dared not challenge it, but that Aristotle had been wrong about this. And then he wanted to come up with an objective measure of the speed of a falling object. So he created a tabletop experiment. He built a slanting bowling ball gutter, basically, a slanting surface. And he put, God knows what, a cannonball at the top and timed it as it rolled toward the bottom. And he discovered that it accelerates, and that it accelerates at a speed of 32 seconds per second. How he got to the 32 seconds per second, given the fact that they had no equations at the time, I haven't checked into. Nonetheless, so then we had a competition between two different forms of truth. Received truth, God speaking in your ear, and of course, the records of those to whom God had spoken in the holy books, the scriptures, versus the book of nature that Galileo began to explore seriously. But you're absolutely right in summarizing what I was saying. These battles over objective truth are very subjective, and they're very irrational. And it's just one group trying to ace another group out of power and then humiliate it.
Yeah, and if as a friend put it, if epistemology is reduced to power, where is it? That's an interesting thing, because.
But it means that when we go to when a person like me goes to fact check in scientific sources, all of those sources are biased in some way because they're all a product of these subculture wars.
Yes, they're all a product of like a status competition, a power competition.
Right.
Man, where did I hear this? The idea that, okay, so in my experience, a lot of the best information comes from the lowest status sources because they're not involved in power games. They get left out of the baseball games by the other kids.
Right.
They're shunned kind of by default. And then when that information, does come to the surface in public light in some way, the attack against it is not a scientific or truth-based argument, but a status-based argument. These are the crackpots. These are the weirdos. Don't listen to them because they're low status, not because they're wrong.
Right. Well, I had to fight very hard because I was in science from the age of 10. It was my fucking life. It was my only life, Michael. And then I got an opportunity coming out of my junior and senior year at NYU. I had 4 grad school fellowships in a field that didn't exist yet, that I was going to have to piece together myself, neuroscience. And some of them were extremely comfortable fellowships. And I had a chance to go into a culture I knew nothing about, because it was the culture of the kids who used to pick up their bats and balls and move to another field when they saw me coming. And it was popular culture. I knew nothing about it. And I took that path instead of going to grad school. I was doing my own graduate education.
And I think that was probably the right thing.
Yeah. And so I had so I had been since the age of 12, I've been after what I call the gods inside of us. And when I turned 13 and was bar mitzvahed, about 2 months before I was bar mitzvahed, I had a sudden realization. I was an atheist. But I couldn't confess to myself that I was an atheist, or I'd blow the only party in Buffalo, New York I'd ever be invited to in my life, my bar mitzvah, and all the presents. So I don't know how we compartmentalize these things in our minds, but I put this thing in a closet of my mind that I was an atheist and went on with the bar mitzvah. And then there were voluminous presents, and it took me 2 months to write the thank you notes for all the presents. And as soon as I was finished with all the thank you notes, I was free to confess that I was an atheist without blowing anything. But there's a problem. I was free to confess I was an atheist at the end of August. In September, in the Jewish calendar, come the 2 highest holidays of the Jewish calendar: Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And my parents were absolutely committed to getting me to the synagogue. And I didn't want to go. And they somehow got me in a suit. And they somehow got me in their 4-door blue Fraser. And they somehow got me all the way to Richmond Avenue, where the synagogue was. And I would go no further. So my parents were dragging at my heels. They were dragging at my ankles, trying to get me out of the car. And I was holding on to the nice, sturdy, American-made door frame. And I had a sudden realization. I'm an atheist, okay? So there are no gods in this scene. There are no gods in the heaven. There are no gods under the earth. But there are gods in this scene. Where are they? They're in this incredible passion of my parents to drag me up the sidewalk like a sack of meat and mulch my face on the irregularities of the pavement, if that's what it takes to get me to the synagogue. And I had a sudden realization. Galileo, one of my heroes, made a discovery by taking an instrument that was designed for seeing on the straightaway, seeing horizontally. It was designed to allow the Dutch, who invented this thing, to see the troops of the Spanish before the Spanish could realize they'd been detected. The Spanish coming over the horizon.
Right.
It was called the spyglass. And Galileo did something absolutely outrageous with that spyglass. Instead of looking horizontally, he turned it up at the sky. Now, look, everybody knew that the sky was the bottom of God's living room rug. Looking up at the sky was looking up God's underwear. It's simply something you didn't do. And everybody knew one other thing. Because the sky was God's realm, everything was perfect. And Aristotle had told us that the perfect shape is the circle or the sphere. So everything up there had to be a circle or a sphere. Well, when Galileo turned his telescope up, he discovered that things were not, in fact, perfect circles and spheres. They were lumpy and craggy and filled with pockmarks and all kinds of strange things. And one of them had moons. It was a big rock with little rocks around it. So Galileo changed the human relationship to nature by changing the direction in which he looked. And Anton van Leeuwenhoek was a draper in Amsterdam. He imported fabrics. And he used a lens. Galileo's device had been a tube with lenses at both ends. That was the spyglass, and which he recreated as a telescope. And Anton van Leeuwenhoek used a lens to see how fine the weave was in the fabrics that he was importing. And it occurred to him one day to grind the thing a little differently, the lens, and to turn it down, and to turn it down at pond water. And he discovered in the pond water all these things he called animalcules, a whole universe of living beings that humans had lived alongside ever since humans have been humans, and that they had never known existed before. And he had balls. He really did, van Leeuwenhoek, because van Leeuwenhoek also looked at fresh human sperm with this device he created.
Was he the discoverer?
Yeah, just think that he had the courage it took. You know where the source was of the fresh human sperm. And he wrote to the Royal Academy, the leading institute of science at the time in England, about his discovery because he found animalcules in that too. Sperm. That was the discovery of sperm. So my job, I realized, with my parents pulling at my ankles and treading my socks and me holding on to the car frame, was to turn the telescope inward and look for the gods within. Now, really, this wasn't anything original. Freud had done this 70 years earlier. But for me, it was revelatory. And so I've been doing all these things simultaneously. I've been involved. Well, I've published in scientific journals or spoken at scholarly conferences in 11 different scientific fields. And in other words, I've been taken seriously in 11 different scientific
fields. And I didn't mean to imply otherwise at all.
Yeah.
I was trying to validate. I was trying to validate you, actually.
So at any rate, so when I took a detour into popular culture, I realized very rapidly that I had a periscope position, that I could look around and see what I felt I was doing was going into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. And that's what I was really looking for, that dark underbelly. And I was looking for the land where the gods are, the gods that I had seen in my parents. And I found I was in the perfect place by total accident. I was in the perfect place because what is a rock concert? It is a ritual in which you are summoned to set aside your normal daily self and rise up to some kind of self over which you have no control, that comes from your emotional center, that joins with the emotional selves of 1,000 or 17,000 or 120,000 other people, and where even the artists on stage go through a transcendent experience. On a really good night, they step onto the stage, they see how the eyes of the audience are widened, they watch as the audience members melt their individual identities, and as they meld into one big protoplasmic soup, one big organism like an amoeba. They sense how that amoeba reaches a pseudopod out to them like a tunnel and sends its energy through them as if they were an empty pipe. And then the energy is transmogrified somewhere around here and thrown back to the audience. And they have an out-of-body experience. They see all this as if they were on the ceiling watching the whole thing take place. So they are seized by the gods within. And this whole thing is a communion with the gods. Why? Because the audience are out of their normal selves and become part of something bigger than themselves. And the artist goes through a different manifestation of the very same thing, becoming a part of something higher than himself. And how did I know this? Well, in high school, my parents were kind enough to send me to a private school because I was doing so miserably in the public school. And they didn't realize that I was doing as miserably as I was because I was educating myself. So they made me make a promise if I went to this private school that I would actually work at my homework. And I made that promise. I was desperate to get out. And it was the same batch of kids who had picked up their balls and bats and moved to another field when they'd seen me coming. So, kids have in high school, they have a basic ritual. You vote for a president of the class, and he's the most popular kid in the class. As vice president, the second most popular kid in the class. A secretary, the most popular girl in the class. Remember, it's the 1950s. And a Jew as the treasurer.
The treasurer. There you go.
Yes.
So, I can say that because I'm Jewish too.
Right. So that was a standard structure. But then the school at that point set up functional committees that actually had to get things done. The school had a gathering of all the students first thing in the morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. And that lasted for 45 minutes to an hour. And they had a committee that ran this. It scheduled 2 of these events a week. I mean, it actually created 2 of the events a week. And the head of the committee was the MC every single day at these school assemblies. So they voted me to that position 2 years in a row. Why? Because you get a bunch of popular kids in a room and they have no idea of what to do, not a clue. So they look around for somebody who does have a clue, which tends to be me in many circumstances, thank goodness. And so one day, the juniors came to me. And the juniors said, we're having a dance coming up. Could you advertise it for us? Because I'm the face of the morning assemblies. And they didn't realize how ironic that statement was. If there was a dance anywhere in the city of Buffalo, New York, I was cordially invited to stay as far away as possible, preferably Cleveland. Nonetheless, I put a record on a turntable, and I can't dance. You know, every 2 years, my parents would try to rescue me from my alien status and turn me into a normal kid. And one year, their technique for doing it was to enroll me in a dance class, and I couldn't dance. The girls wouldn't dance with me. The instructors would take pity on me and dance with me, and then were very sorry they had, because I'd mashed all of their toes. I couldn't master these basic dance steps. So I went onto this stage at my school to dance when I can't dance. So I made a whole lot of moves that no one had ever seen before. And I saw the eyes widen, even of the kids who hated me the most. I saw their pupils dilating. I saw their individual selves melting. I saw them melting into a communal mass. I saw that energy come through me as if through an empty pipe. And and go up to around my head and get transmogrified and sent back down in a continuous feedback loop. And I had an out-of-body experience. I was on the ceiling watching this whole thing take place. So I had been seized by the gods inside of me and had brought the gods out in an audience without knowing it. And when this finished, the audience did something that seemed to take a lot of skill, and they did it as if they had been practicing it all their lives, but they'd never done it before, and they would never do it again in my time in the school. They surged down to the foot of the stage. They picked me up off the stage. They put me on their shoulders. They carried me out of the auditorium, and they carried me up the pathway to the building where we had our classes. And only then did they let me down. So if we're doing a catalog of forms of truth, I've just described a form of truth that is probably very closely related to the scriptures, very closely related to the experience of those who felt they'd been seized by God and been turned into a writing implement or an enunciator for God's will. That too was probably, for many of them, one of these ecstatic, transcendent, mystic experiences. So we have the religious truth, we have the objective truth, the scientific truth, the secular truth, and we have the ecstatic truth, which speaks itself so powerfully that you have no control. It just takes you over. And which probably sits somewhere between the religious truth and the secular truth. But we in science have not coped with that truth of the ecstatic experience. And I've been after that all my life. And I'm very aware when I'm sitting here, I work all my waking hours with the exception of the time that I go out for walks and the hour I set aside for my girlfriend. And I watch as my fingers make decisions about how to solve problems, because there are problems constantly coming up when you're typing, when you're researching, when you're running groups online. Little problems like what's the best next 3 sets of moves with my fingers? What is going to save me the most time and energy? Well, what you discover when you're making those microsecond decisions, those 1-second decisions, is that something in you has gotten there before you and has already made those decisions and is implementing its conclusions about what the answers are before you get a chance to finish thinking about it. What the fuck? What is this hidden self?
Yeah.
I call them the selves below the floorboards of the self, because there are lots of them. But what is this? Is it a proprioceptive self, a self that depends on all of your senses of what's going on around you? Is it a muscular self? Is it both? What in the world is it? How does it perform its logical operations? Because it does. It sees problems and it solves them in an instant, in a second or two or less. And it's a self with which you walk around every day. And I'm currently reading a book about the hand. And the author points out that your body, if you're playing baseball, which I can't do, I can't catch a ball and I can't throw a ball. But if you're, unlike me, able to catch balls and throw balls, when you're keeping your eye on the ball, your body is bringing together the operation of hundreds of systems and subsystems, hundreds, and it's adjusting them all so they work together just right. And it's doing all of this without any conscious awareness on your part at all. All you have to do is keep your eye on the ball. Your proprioceptive self or your muscular self does the rest. And it is capable of solving problems on a level with hundreds of systems and sometimes thousands of systems that it coordinates in ways you never could. So what the hell is that self? And how do we bring it to the surface? Remember the second law of science. Look at things right under your noses if you've never seen them before. Look for things that you and other people take for granted and do not see, and bring them to visibility. Well, this is one of the greatest things that evades visibility that we just don't cope with, despite the fact that in tennis, one day I ran into, I was at the club, the cafe, where I wrote my books at that point. And sitting near me was an interesting looking blonde. She turned out to be a tennis instructor. And she tried to explain that her primary job is to get your mind out of tennis so that your body would take over. So she's talking about using this proprioceptive muscular system that we're talking about. And she's talking about it, letting it solve problems in fractions of a second of time that your conscious brain could never deal with, would always be too late on. So sports coaches are aware of this self below the floorboards of the self, the proprioceptive and muscular self. Why aren't we in science able to even articulate what the hell it is and how it works and how best to use its powers? There was a guy, again, from the Tea Lounge, the cafe where I used to write my books, and I take nighttime walks. I walk about 5.5 miles, 6 miles a day. And at night, I cross the meadow in the park. There's a park 3.5 blocks away from me. It is the most gorgeous park in the world. It's Prospect Park. It's even more gorgeous than Central Park, though it was designed by the same person. But this is his tour de force. And I walk probably 150 yards over a meadow at night. And I look at the stars and the clouds the whole time. I never look down. Well, a meadow is a lumpy, bumpy surface. It has many tricks, and my feet see. So I just let my feet see, and they do a perfect job. They never let me down. Wow. Even if they make a mistake, which they did only once, and they carry me into a hole, my proprioceptive muscular self is real quick, and it gets me out of that hole before my foot can land in it. It gets me across it somehow, and I'm best off looking at the clouds while this is happening. Because if I look down, I'll fuck up my proprioceptive muscular self, which is handling problems brilliantly. I used to get very confused because Microsoft Word, I have 40 to 60 screens running simultaneously.
Wow.
Most of the time. And so that means that when I go to find a file in Microsoft Word, it gives me this list that's so confusing. It's ridiculous. It's not in alphabetical order. It's not in order of the files that I've worked on most recently. It's not in any order discernible to humanity. And it confuses the hell out of me, and it frustrates my conscious logical mind tremendously. So I learned that if I don't let my emotional or my conscious mind get involved in this, and just let my muscular proprioceptive mind work on the problem, it's able to find its way with a lot less frustration.
That's amazing.
So this friend who asked to take a walk with me one night through the park because he found this process amazing, felt it was shamanic. Fine. If my job is to bring the shamanic into the realm of science, fuck it. That's the
If
job.
it's true, it's true.
Yeah, right. So, and if I can point the way for other people to use these capabilities without getting in their way. I mean, you also have to have reason. So you don't do something ghastly. You don't want to kill anybody.
Right.
So you do have to have some brakes on the system, but these things can serve you brilliantly. I also learned, and this was very tricky and very hard to describe, I have to maximize my work time to the best of my ability because I've got a limited amount of time on this planet. And especially now that I'm about to turn 80 in 4 months or something like that, or 6 months, time is much shorter than it used to be. So, and when you're sitting at a club like the Tea Lounge, every time somebody walks in, your extraperipheral vision checks them out to see if they're a man or a woman, checks them out by their profile to see how young and attractive they are, and generally is distracted from what you're doing. So I've learned to use my eyes so they never deviate from what I am working on. Who could imagine you could discipline your eyes like that? It took a year, possibly 2 years, but now they are disciplined. And it means I have a domestic manager. He takes care of my laundry and my food and my water supply. When he comes into the room, it's as if he doesn't exist, because my eyes do not leave my screen and the task that I'm working on at the moment. And that goes very much against the way our instincts are prone to use our eyes.
Absolutely. You know, that what that actually reminds me of is something that I've heard Christian saints describe when they're trying not to look at women when they're going around the
Right.
world. Custody of the eyes. They absolutely have like a term for that discipline, and it seems like you've independently developed it.
Right. So, and there are lots of these little tricks that you have to
Yeah.
deal with in life, but they're relevant because they come from the realm of truths of the cells below the floorboards of the self.
I love this whole topic.
Yeah. So that gives us 3 categories of truth.
Yeah. I really like the suggestion that the ecstatic / proprioceptive, I expect they're kind of connected. And I like the idea that you said they may be some kind of Hegelian synthesis of the two, some kind of blend
Well,
of the two.
opposites are joined at the hip is the Bloomian expression.
There you go. Okay.
Opposites are different parts of the same process.
Yeah.
And they need each other.
Yeah. Yeah. The resolution of kind of abstract ideas, models about the world, metaphors, scientific facts, and so on, and embodied things in a person, like the manifestation or the peak of all of this truth seeking expresses itself physically and spontaneously.
Right.
It's really kind of a beautiful thing that feels true. My proprioceptive sense thinks that's correct.
So
Yeah.
that's truth. And the question is, in a truth market, when you ask people what a truth is, they're never forced to define what a truth
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And I think that's my expectation is, given that there are no two people that necessarily agree on what truth is, let alone what constitutes it, let alone what the content of truth is. And so rather than try to impose a definition of truth that then everyone who participates have to accept, one of the advantages of a market forum is that people can use whatever criteria in their head that they like, as long as they make a bet.
Right. That's true. Um, it would be interesting to know where different people get their different versions of truth, but people get their versions of truth from the subculture they belong to.
Yeah.
There is a tremendous amount of conformity enforcement
Oh
within
yeah.
subcultures.
Oh yeah.
So the MAGA Republicans are brutally disciplined. If they say something that's out of line, that's really frowned on, and they have a word for this kind of social rejection, and it's called rhino, a Republican in name only. And they've been priding themselves for the last 12 years on rejecting rhinos, on tossing rhinos out. What is that? Conformity enforcement.
Yeah.
And that means that there are only a narrow set of ways in which to answer most questions, the ways of the dominant subcultures in the position to answer those questions. So it's the MAGA Republicans versus what are called us corporate Democrats, in other words, moderate Democrats, versus ultra left Democrats, and there's a voiceless group today, and it's the traditional Republicans. It's traditional conservatives who see the flaws in Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So, but which subculture you come from is going to determine to a large extent your statements about the world. It may not determine what you mark on a truth meter as truth, because you're going to go with your gut feeling, which will sometimes go against the flow of your subculture. Not most of the time, but sometimes.
Yeah. I'm wondering. Well, actually, I wanted to tell a story about the embodied cognition that you're talking about, um, and share something in case you haven't seen it, because it might be useful for your research. And also, just I love that topic and can't get enough of it. I found a video of an Indian mystic, I suppose, named Kuda Bux, and he used to go on TV, and he would be completely blindfolded and have clay put over his closed eyes so that you can see the imprint of his closed eyes in the clay and prove that his
Wow.
eyes were closed. And then he would have somebody go up to a chalkboard and make it all kinds of crazy squiggles and then write a random word. And
Right.
then Kuda Bux would stand up and go over there and trace the line exactly, and then
Amazing.
trace the word exactly. And there's film of this on YouTube. And I I love this because it's anomalistic. It
Right.
goes, "Hey, science, deal with this." And I'd be happy to share that with you. But in any case, I just think it's a very exciting topic that is a low hanging fruit in the knowledge world, as you've identified.
Well, there is a science writer, alas, she's dead now, named Sharon Bagley, who, among other things, was the science writer for the Wall Street Journal. And she did a brilliant synthesis, putting together the work primarily of a guy named Timothy Wilson, who had written a book about the adaptive subconscious, with the work of a guy named Ramachandran about what he called blind sight. And she put it together with an experiment. There was a woman who had a disease that wiped out all of the myelinated neurons from her touch receptors, and only left the unmyelinated neurons. Well, the myelinated neurons are like electrical wires wrapped in insulation, and they're for fast transmission of information. The unmyelinated neurons are like the bare copper cable. and therefore slow neuron transmissions. Well, what as Sharon, okay, we're getting away from the experiment. So in the experiment, there's a woman whose myelinated neurons from her touch receptors are gone, absolutely gone. So the experimenters take her arm and put a shield up so she can't see her own arm. And they stroke her arm with a very soft brush. And they ask her what she feels. And she can't tell them because she's not feeling it. The myelinated neurons go to her conscious brain and they're gone. And then they say, tell me how you feel. And she says, I feel warm and fuzzy. In other words, there is one system that goes to the conscious brain and another system that goes to the non-conscious brain, presumably to the emotional brain, the limbic system. And we have both our conscious sight and our blind sight. We have both our conscious touch and our non-conscious touch. So we have a whole doppelganger of ourselves that operates below the level of consciousness. And that's probably where these selves below the floorboards of the self come from. But how they process information, they obviously do it much faster than our conscious selves do. Much faster.
Yeah.
It's beyond me. It's just learning to use those powers is incredibly important, and being able to articulate what this is all about so other people can take it for granted that they can use these powers in the future. I don't know if I'll ever have time for that challenge, because I have my next 2 books all mapped out, and that's my lifetime of books.
By the way, looks like we have the same one in our vicinity
here.
Yes.
So that's the one about the ecstatic experience and the tribal nature of music and how music expresses the soul of a group. Music becomes the tongue of a subculture trying to express itself. And it's not just the music, it's the artist's stance. The artist's physical way of standing conveys far more to us than just about anything else the artist does. So Joan Jett has one way of raising her fist defiantly. John Mellencamp has a whole different way of raising his fist. And these two constellations of muscular movements have vastly different meanings, despite the fact that if we were to describe them, we'd say, oh, he's raising his fist, she's raising her fist, and it would sound as if they're doing the same thing. No, they are not. Prince conveys or conveyed. Prince is one of the most brilliant performers of all time. So is John Mellencamp. And so in a full hour and 10 minutes worth of moving muscularly around that stage, God knows how many meanings Prince conveys to those selves below the floorboards of the self, or how many John expressed. But ultimately, the expression that they're doing is the expression of a subculture's self below the floorboard of emotional self stance.
Yeah.
And because they stand for that, they validate that subculture. They say that subculture has a right to exist, which was one of the most important statements that John Mellencamp made with his songs, with his performances, and with his life, and that Joan Jett made with her songs, her performance, and her life. Prince, Prince was beyond. One of the big battles for us, the team who were working for him, was that in those days, when you signed a black artist, when you were Warner Brothers and you signed a black artist, the black artist automatically went to the black department and never reached the white department at all. And our biggest challenge at one point was to knock down that barrier, to de-ghettoize Prince's music, to let them know that Prince's music belonged on rock radio, on FM radio. And it's very hard for me, who worked with Prince for 7 years, building him from a total unknown to a superstar. It's very hard for me to know who Prince's audience was, what the subculture was on behalf of whom Prince spoke. But we were moving into something we've gone backwards on. We were moving into post-racialism. And Prince and another one of my clients, Michael Jackson, both spoke to that. So, but one way or the other, they were the tongue for the audience. They were the muscular expression. What is a tongue? It's a bundle of muscles. And they were the muscular expression of that audience's soul.
Did they know? Did they know what subculture they were expressing for?
I don't think so. I think Prince had been building his own subculture since he was a teenager. John Mellencamp probably had an idea of what subcultures he was reaching. But here's an arrogant statement. So when I met John, the press loathed him. One day I had been driving down Sunset Boulevard before I ever met John Mellencamp. And a song came on the radio that was so compelling, it made me do something I had never done before in my life and have never done since. I couldn't drive. The song was so compelling. I had to find a parking space and just park and sit there and listen. And it was John Mellencamp's Hurt So Good. What the hell is that all about?
Yeah.
I can't tell you. And if I can't, then I'm missing a big swatch of knowledge. But when John and I started working together, the press loathed and despised him. And I taught him how to communicate with the press. And I worked very hard on the press. It took 3 years to turn them around in their perception of John. Well, my sense is that if John ever lost that contact with the press people, he would have a hard time knowing who his audience was. Prince lost that contact. Prince became the artist who formerly was Prince after he fired his team. He had a team of geniuses. He had Bob Cavallo, who had produced 11 movies, including Purple Rain, and would go on to head Disney, which was losing $250,000 a year. And Disney wanted to sell its music operation. And Bob came to them and said, look, please don't sell it. Just give me a year. And indeed, Bob took that $250 million loss to zero loss. The next year, he took it from zero to $250 million profit. The next year, he took it from $250 million to $500 million at a time when the record industry was dying. That's the quality of genius of Bob Cavallo. And he had me, a person who splashed into this field he didn't know from science, which gave me some considerable advantages. But I feel that Prince lost touch with his audience when he fired us. And so he was wandering in the wilderness. And Prince is afraid of men. He only is comfortable with women, and attractive women at that. So when he discovered the internet in something like 1995, and he put together his own internet group, which no musical artist that I'm aware of had ever done before. And it returned his sense of his audience to him. Now he could be in touch with them without being afraid of them and having to run out of the room.
Yep.
So, but we're getting off the topic of how you express. By expressing your deepest self, there's a whole generation of people who've grown up with the same experience you have. And you end up expressing something inexpressible for a vast number of people, something that even I, the book writer, and an explorer of everything, still cannot get a handle on.
Well, that's beautiful.
So we should go. I have to go back to work. But this has been, I've never talked about this stuff before, Michael. So
I'm really honored and gratified to have been the first audience member. It's a really exciting
can you send
area.
me a copy of the video, and also send me the URL when you get it up so I can send it out to my 15,000 faithful, whatever they are?
Beautiful. I sure will.
And if you get me a copy of the MP4 or whatever it is file, then I can just put it in my computer and know it's there.
I'll make sure you have everything that I have.
Terrific. Well, it's been wonderful. And I'm glad this was of some help, because it was certainly of help to me.
I'm really glad to hear that. I'm really glad.
So I will hopefully see you on another occasion.
Sounds great. I look forward to it, and we can be in touch anytime.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Howard.